The sheriff stood on my deck, tapped the paperwork, and delivered the verdict. Mr. Calloway, this structure is flagged for removal. 6 years of sweat, my life savings, my family's home, all because someone quietly redrew a pink line on a map. They called it an administrative update. I knew it for what it really was, a declaration of war. But that was the end of the story. To understand why I stood my ground, you have to go back to the beginning. People like to pretend dreams arrive fully formed. They don't. Mine showed up early, rough around the edges, and usually with a hammer in my hand. When I was a kid, I used to climb trees with a tool belt cinched too tight around my waist. I'd wedge scrap boards between branches and pretend I was building something permanent, something that would outlast me. Most of it came crashing down within minutes, but I never took that as failure. I took it as instruction. I learned early that wood tells you the truth if you listen long enough. By the time I was a teenager, I carried a dog-eared copy of Off-Grid Living in my backpack, like other kids carried comic books. The pages were creased and stained, the spine cracked. I didn't understand half of what I was reading, but I understood the idea. A man could build a place with his own 2 hands and answer to no one but the land beneath his boots. Most people smiled when I talked about it. Some laughed. "You'll grow out of it," they said. "Life gets complicated. Real responsibilities show up." They were right about one thing. Life did get complicated. I got older. I built a business. I married a woman who understood that silence could be just as comforting as conversation. We had kids, bills, deadlines, the usual gravity that pulls people away from the things they once believed in. But the dream didn't leave. It waited. For nearly a decade, I restored houses for other people. Old Victorians with sagging floors, forgotten craftsman homes with paint layered like tree rings. I fixed what time had broken. I reinforced beams, squared doorways, and learned how to make something old stand straight again. Clients called it work. I called it practice. Every night, after the kids were asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and sketch ideas in a notebook I never showed anyone. Roof lines, staircases, decks that caught the morning sun, places meant to be lived in, not flipped. Friends told me I was chasing a fantasy. "You don't have time. You don't have land. You don't have the right background." What they meant was, you don't have permission. They didn't understand that permission was the one thing I'd never planned on asking for. By 2017, the noise had grown loud enough that even I started to wonder if they were right. The kids were getting older. The business was steady, safe, comfortable. That's when the idea finally stopped being a dream and started becoming a question. If not now, then when? I didn't want a vacation property. I didn't want a weekend escape. I wanted a place that would demand something from me. A place that would test whether I believed my own stories. I wanted land that didn't care who I was. So, when I finally stood at the edge of that canyon for the first time, wind pushing against my chest, cedar bending but not breaking, something settled in my bones. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This was a promise I'd made to myself a long time ago, and waited years to keep. And I had no idea how much that promise was about to cost me. I didn't find the land the way realtors like to tell stories about it. There was no handshake, no gate, no sign promising future potential. I found it at the end of a road that barely deserved the name, 12 miles from the nearest pavement, the kind of track that rattles your teeth and makes you question your decisions with every switchback. Cell service disappeared early. Common sense followed soon after. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the empty kind, the honest kind. Wind moving through cedar. A distant hawk circling somewhere above the canyon. The ground under my boots wasn't flat or friendly. It sloped hard, dropped away without apology, and dared me to underestimate it. 12 acres, steep, unforgiving. Untouched by utility lines or tidy boundaries. No driveway, no water, no power, no reception. And most importantly, no HOA. I didn't trust the view alone. I trusted the ground. I walked the property line alone that first day. I scraped away dirt and pine needles until I found them. Iron pins driven deep into the bedrock by a surveyor 40 years ago. They weren't guesses. They weren't suggestions. They were final. I checked each one against the deed I carried folded in my pocket, north to south, east to west. They matched to the inch. I stood at the bluff's edge afterward and looked out over the canyon as the light shifted, shadows crawling slowly across the rock walls like they'd been doing long before anyone thought to sell this land. This place didn't care who I was. It didn't care what I planned to build. It didn't care if I failed. That's why I wanted it. The price wasn't cheap, not in money, and definitely not in effort. Friends asked why I didn't buy something closer to town. Easier access, utilities already run, permits already mapped. What they were really asking was why I didn't buy convenience. Because convenience comes with strings. This land came with none. I didn't buy it because it was easy. I bought it because it was honest. Title clean, deed recorded, taxes filed, no covenants hiding in fine print. No community bylaws telling me how tall my grass could grow or what color my roof had to be. Just dirt, sky, and responsibility. The day the paperwork cleared, I stood there again. Same bluff, same wind, and tried to imagine what could exist here someday. Not a mansion, not a showpiece, a home that belonged to the mountain as much as it belonged to us. Something built slow, built right, built to last. There were doubts, of course. I had a business to run, kids to raise, zero experience with heavy machinery. People reminded me of that often. They told me it would take too long, cost too much, break my body before it ever broke ground. They weren't wrong, but none of that felt like a reason to stop. It felt like a reason to start. I didn't hire contractors, didn't call in favors. I didn't want shortcuts. I wanted the work to mean something. If this place was going to stand, it was going to stand on effort I understood. The first night we camped there, the kids huddled close to the fire while the dark pressed in from all sides. Coyotes called out from somewhere beyond the tree line, close enough to remind us we weren't in charge. My wife looked at me, half smiling, half questioning. "You sure about this?" she asked. I looked up at the stars, sharp, endless, untouched by anything man-made. "I've never been more sure," I said. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know what it would demand. But standing there, with iron pins sunk into stone beneath my boots, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I hadn't bought land. I had bought the right to build a life without asking permission. And that was something I wasn't willing to give back quietly. Nothing about the first year was heroic. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sweeping victories, just small, grinding progress measured in blisters, sore backs, and nights where sleep came faster than hope. I started with brush, cedar thickets so dense sunlight barely touched the ground. Every cut released a sharp, clean smell that stuck to my clothes and my hands. I cleared just enough space to work, just enough to imagine where a foundation might one day sit. I learned quickly that the mountain didn't give ground easily. Every root fought back. Every rock had opinions. The skid steer came next, rented, scarred, louder than it had any right to be. I barely knew how to operate it. The first time I eased it onto the slope, my heart climbed into my throat. One wrong move, and I would have rolled the whole thing into the ravine below. I worked slow, too slow, according to the rental clerk. But I didn't care. Speed was for people who could afford mistakes. By the end of that first summer, I had something close to a level pad and a new respect for gravity. Year 2 was concrete, rebar cut and tied by hand, forms built, torn apart, rebuilt again. I hauled gravel in buckets because trucks couldn't reach the site. The cement mixer I bought secondhand screamed like a dying animal every time I flipped the switch. I learned to listen to it the way you listen to an old dog, knowing when to push, knowing when to stop. My son helped when he could. Small hands passing tools, asking questions I didn't always have answers for. But I let him help anyway. This wasn't just about getting the work done. It was about showing him how work gets done. We slept in a tent that year, all 4 of us. The ground was never quite flat. Rain found its way in no matter how careful we were. Raccoons treated our cooler like a personal challenge. Coyotes howled so close some nights it felt like they were circling us, deciding whether we belonged. We did. Year 3 brought framing. That's when the mountain finally started to see what I was trying to do. The first beams went up crooked. I tore them down and did them again. Nothing stayed square on a slope like this without a fight. Wind shoved ladders. Sun burned the back of my neck raw. I cracked a rib slipping on loose gravel and kept working anyway because stopping felt worse. by fall, a skeleton stood where there had once been nothing but brush and rock. I remember stepping back and seeing it for the first time. Not as a dream, but as a shape that cast a shadow. That was the moment doubt showed up uninvited. People warned me about it, said this was when most folks quit, when the novelty wears off and the math stops working. When you start adding up how much time, how much money, how much of yourself you've already poured in. I kept going. Year 4 slowed everything down. Weather stalled us for weeks at a time. Injuries stacked up. Business back home demanded attention. There were stretches when I couldn't make the drive up at all. Each time I returned, the mountain looked at me like it was waiting to see if I'd given up. I hadn't. I salvaged cedar for the walls. Old boards aged and scarred, like they'd already lived a life before they found their way to me. I cut and fit each one by hand. Nothing uniform, nothing easy. The kind of work that forces patience on you whether you want it or not. The balcony rails nearly broke me. I forged them in my shop back in Ridgefield on weekends, then hauled them up the mountain one piece at a time. Every switchback felt like a gamble. Every clank in the truck bed sounded like something expensive about to disappear into the canyon. By the time they were installed, my hands shook when I tightened the last bolt. Year 5 brought light. Literal light. Solar panels went up under a sky so blue it looked fake. For years we'd lived by candles, propane lanterns, and a small generator that sounded like it ran on pure anger. The first night the system came online, the house didn't hum or flicker. It just breathed. My daughter stood in her room, staring at the light switch like it might betray her if she touched it again. When she did, and the room filled with warm, steady light, she cried. I didn't. I walked outside instead. I stood there in the dark, looking up at the roofline silhouetted against the stars, and felt a kind of satisfaction that doesn't ask for witnesses. Year 6 was finishing work. Windows set, floors sanded. The last section of reclaimed redwood siding I'd saved for years finally went up. My wife joked that the place looked like a mountain museum. I knew what she meant. Every detail had intention. Every scar told the truth. This wasn't a house built fast. It wasn't a house built cheap. It was a house built honestly. On the morning I finished the upper deck posts, the air smelled like fresh stain and pine sap. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker balanced on a beam. For the first time in years, it felt like we were catching up to the dream instead of chasing it. I believed the hardest part was behind us. That's the thing about work like this. It gives you confidence. It teaches you that effort solves problems, that patience beats force, that if you keep showing up, things eventually come together. What it doesn't teach you is how to defend something you've built when the threat doesn't come from weather, gravity, or your own mistakes. It doesn't prepare you for clipboards, or pink lines, or people who see 6 years of blood and sweat and decide it would look better as a view from their clubhouse balcony. Standing there that morning, stain drying under the sun, I had no idea that the mountain wasn't done testing me yet. I thought I was building a home. I didn't know I was building a line someone else would try to cross. The first sign something was wrong wasn't a letter. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't even a knock. It was the sound of tires where tires had no business being. I was up on the upper deck that morning, brushing the final coat of stain onto the posts. The air smelled like cedar and solvent. A Bluetooth speaker played low, something old and familiar. The house felt finished in a way I hadn't let myself believe until that moment. Then I heard gravel crunching below. I frowned. There was only one way up here, a narrow fire road I'd chained off myself. I hadn't heard the chain rattle. I hadn't heard anything except engines easing forward like they belonged. 4 vehicles crept into view. Late model SUVs, spotless. The kind of clean you only see on cars that never leave pavement. They parked nose to nose with my stacked stone, aligned neatly like someone had practiced the move before. 4 people stepped out. 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing bright orange reflective vests. Navy lettering stitched across the chest read, Highland Peaks, HOA. The woman took the lead. Short blonde hair, sharp sunglasses, a clipboard thick enough to stop a small animal if you dropped it from height. She walked up my drive like she'd memorized every step. You must be Mr. Calloway, she said, already flipping pages. Karen Larson, Community Director, Highland Peaks. I didn't offer my hand. You're about 6 years late to welcome me to the neighborhood. She smiled, tight and practiced. the kind of smile meant to diffuse resistance by pretending it doesn't exist. Actually, she said, tapping the clipboard, this parcel is no longer considered unincorporated land. I climbed down from the ladder slowly, hands still stained dark from the brush. What are you talking about? She turned the clipboard toward me. A glossy digital map stared back. Pastel zoning blocks, clean lines. My property outlined in thin black ink. A section of it, just enough to matter, was shaded pink. As of August of last year, she said, your western boundary falls within the expanded fire protection buffer zone of Highland Peaks. I stared at the map. The edge of my roof barely crossed into the pink. It looked surgical, intentional. You're not listed as a registered member, she continued, flipping pages. Your architectural plans were never submitted to the Community Design Committee, and since no compliance exemption was filed prior to active construction, this dwelling is considered an unapproved structure within HOA jurisdiction. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I'm not in your HOA, I said. I bought this land outright, title, deed, taxes, all filed years ago. Karen nodded slowly, like she was listening to a child explain something she'd already decided to ignore. I understand the confusion, she said, but developments expand, jurisdictions change. It's the property owner's responsibility to stay informed. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a notice of non-compliance. A neat list of violations followed: unauthorized exterior finishes, failure to install an HOA-approved mailbox fixture, non-conforming roofline elements, mailbox fixture on a mountain. You think you can just walk in here and claim this? I asked. It's not about claiming, Karen said smoothly. It's about standards and protecting community value. Behind her, the men fanned out across my property. One took photos, another unspooled a measuring tape. They didn't ask permission. I pulled my phone from my pocket and took the pictures. Her, the vehicles, the vests, the clipboard. Leave, I said. Karen tilted her head. You should consider cooperating. There's a process. We can work with you. I smiled without warmth. That sounds like extortion with extra paperwork. She shrugged. We'll be in touch. They left as calmly as they arrived, tires rolling down the slope like they had already claimed the road. I stood there on my own land, envelope heavy in my hand, staring at the house that had taken 6 years of my life to build. That was the first lie. Not the pink line, not the paperwork. The lie was the assumption underneath it all. They believed I would fold. They believed fatigue would do their work for them. And they were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. The first envelope arrived 3 days later. Glossy, heavy stock. My address printed cleanly, like it belonged on a brochure instead of a warning. Inside was a trifold pamphlet filled with smiling families, trimmed lawns, and a suspiciously athletic deer frozen mid-leap. Across the top, in confident type, it read, Voluntary Integration Pathway. I stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice. Then a third time, slower. The language was gentle, encouraging. The kind of tone meant to sound helpful while quietly closing doors. If I accepted, they'd grant conditional compliance, a 1-year grace period to adapt my structure to community standards, limited exemptions from retroactive architectural review. Translation, kneel now and we'll stop tightening the screws. The back page had a deadline circled in blue ink, 30 days. Below it, a footnote in smaller type warned that failure to respond could result in formal enforcement procedures, access restrictions, civil penalties, and legal claims of non-compliance. I folded the pamphlet and set it beside the sink. That night, it sat on my workbench next to a half-finished spindle I'd been carving for the stair rail. Wood dust clung to the paper like it didn't know where it belonged. I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, because I recognized the play. I'd seen it years earlier in Tacoma, helping an elderly couple fight a rezoning attempt that crept block by block. Same language, same soft deadlines, same promise of cooperation wrapped around a threat. Paper didn't raise its voice. It didn't have to. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one was addressed to me by name. Inside was the same pamphlet, except now my name was printed across the cover, along with a signature line, waiting patiently at the bottom of the page. Someone had added a sticky note. Happy to discuss options, it read. Karen, the message was clear. They weren't asking anymore. By the end of the week, the pressure spread. A letter from a legal firm I'd never heard of arrived by certified mail, outlining potential fines for unpermitted development. Another notice claimed I was out of compliance with updated fire mitigation guidelines. Each one referenced the same thing: the expanded buffer zone. My wife started keeping the envelopes in a neat stack by the door, not because she liked them there, but because she wanted to know how many there were. "How bad is it?" she asked one night, quietly so the kids wouldn't hear. "Not bad," I said. Yet. That was the truth, and it was also the problem. Paper cuts don't hurt much at first. They sting, they irritate. You ignore them because they're small, but they bleed all the same, and if you get enough of them, you start losing something important: time, sleep, certainty. A week later, Karen sent a liaison. He introduced himself as Travis, early 30s, shiny shoes that had never met gravel. He parked his hybrid SUV at the edge of my retaining wall like it was a visitor spot. He smiled a lot. "Mr. Calloway," he said, extending a hand I didn't take. "I'm with Highland Peaks Community Relations. Karen asked me to check in and see if you had questions about the voluntary pathway." "I have one," I said, still working a chisel into a cedar post. "You people always this persistent with land you don't own?" He chuckled like it was a joke. We prefer to think of it as proactive. He talked about fire risk, environmental impact, resale values, liability. Words designed to sound responsible while never quite saying what they wanted. "Your work up here is impressive," he said, nodding toward the house. "Nobody wants to tear it down." I stopped chiseling. The sudden silence felt heavier than any threat. I blew the wood dust from the blade, wiped it once on my jeans, and only then looked up at him. Then stopped trying. For a fraction of a second, the smile faltered, just enough to notice. "Our architectural committee is firm," he said carefully. "Structures inside the buffer present concerns, but there's flexibility built into compliance if you're willing to work with us." I set the chisel back against the grain and resumed my work. "I'm not signing anything," I said, eyes still on the wood. "You come up here again without a court order, I'll file trespass." Travis nodded slowly, the smile returning, thinner this time. "Karen was hoping you'd be more cooperative. Tell Karen I cooperate with people who stay off my property." He stepped back, glanced once more at the house, then turned toward his SUV. The engine started, gravel shifted, tires rolled away. They weren't angry, they weren't rushed, they were patient. That's what worried me most. They believed this was a waiting game, and that eventually, fatigue would do what force couldn't. They were counting on the fact that most people don't fight paperwork. Most people get tired. Most people fold. Standing there, looking at the growing stack of envelopes by the door, I felt something settle in my chest. Solid, immovable. They weren't trying to win a legal battle. They were trying to wear me down until I disappeared. And I wasn't about to let paper decide what 6 years of work was worth. I didn't plan to go public. That's the truth. I'm not wired for spectacle, and I've never believed shouting makes facts clearer. But paper has a way of isolating you. It keeps the fight quiet, one envelope at a time, until you start to feel like the only person in the room. So, one night, after the kids were asleep and the house settled into that familiar creak it makes when the temperature drops, I sat down at the computer and told the story straight. No music, no edits, no anger, just 6 years of footage, photos, timestamps. A calm voice explaining how a house built by hand suddenly became non-compliant because a pink line appeared on a map. I posted it and shut the laptop. By morning, it had moved. Messages came in from people I didn't know. Retired builders, surveyors, veterans, folks who'd fought their own quiet battles with HOAs and zoning boards and lost more than they wanted to admit. They weren't loud, they were tired. By the second day, the comments section took on a life of its own. Most of it was support. Measured, thoughtful, grateful. People sharing their own stories, offering documents, pointing me toward public records I didn't know existed. It felt less like the internet and more like a town hall that had finally found its microphone. Then I saw it. A comment sitting near the top, boosted by thousands of likes. Much simpler to introduce the entire bunch to the bears and coyotes. In wooded areas, the remains would never be found. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because I agreed, because it scared me how quickly righteous anger turns feral when people believe the system won't protect them. The comment wasn't a plan, it was a pressure release valve, a dark joke born out of frustration, not intent. Still, it crossed a line. I deleted it, not to protect the HOA, not to protect Karen, but to protect the fight. I typed a response before removing it, something simple. This ends with the truth, not threats. A few people pushed back, told me I was being soft, said the HOA deserved whatever came their way. They were wrong. The moment a fight stops being about what's right and starts being about what feels good, you lose something you don't get back. I didn't build a home for 6 years just to burn down the ground it stood on. Later, I learned the HOA had been watching. Screenshots circulated, emails forwarded. Someone tried to float the idea that I was inciting hostility, that I was fostering a dangerous online environment. It was a neat trick, using someone else's anger to stain my motives. But it didn't stick, because the record showed something else. I hadn't threatened anyone. I hadn't encouraged anything. I had shut it down. And that mattered. The attention kept growing. A local freelancer reached out, asking if he could hike up and see the place. I said yes, on one condition, no dramatics. Just the facts, the documents, the house as it stood. What surprised me most wasn't the volume of support. It was the quality. People didn't want blood. They wanted daylight. They wanted to know how lines could move quietly, how rules could expand without a vote, how a home could be reclassified without the owner ever being asked. They wanted to know where the system broke. And reading those questions, scrolling past the noise, I felt the shift. This wasn't just my problem anymore. It was a pattern, the kind that survives because it stays quiet. And I realized something important, something that would shape every decision I made next. If I was going to fight this, I couldn't let it turn ugly. I couldn't let it turn loud. I had to keep it precise. Because precision is what scares people who rely on pressure. And somewhere behind those comments, buried under the noise, the truth was waiting, patient, exact, and ready to be used. I didn't start with lawyers. I started with the map. The version Karen had shown me was clean, too clean. Pastel colors, smooth lines, everything presented like a finished answer instead of a question. It bothered me more the longer I thought about it. Real land doesn't behave that neatly. Neither do honest boundaries. So I went back to the basics. I pulled my original survey from 2017, the one I'd checked myself, iron pins and all. I spread it out on the kitchen table and compared it to the HOA overlay on my screen. At first glance, the shapes looked similar enough to pass. That was the trick. The lie lived in the margins. I printed the GIS layers separately and laid them side by side. Parcel layer, overlay layer, tax assessor layer. That's when it clicked. The overlay existed. The parcel boundaries still listed me as the owner. But the tax layer didn't change. No new district code, no adjusted assessment footprint, no effective date that matched the expansion Karen claimed had happened administratively. You don't get jurisdiction without revenue. You don't get authority without accountability. Someone had drawn a line that wasn't meant to be taxed. I dug deeper into the metadata, edit history, timestamps, user notes that most people never read because they assume the map tells the truth by default. The overlay had been added in a single update window, no public hearing reference, no assessor sign-off, no cross-check with the county's revenue system. It wasn't sloppy, it was surgical. I drove back up the mountain that afternoon and walked the property again, slower this time. I scraped away dirt and pine needles where I knew they'd be, and there they were. The iron pins still sunk deep into bedrock, exactly where a surveyor had set them decades earlier. I checked them against the deed. They matched, to the inch. I stood at the bluff and zoomed out, not on the map, but in my head. I traced the ridgeline west, followed the curve of the canyon, noticed how the elevation peaked right where my house sat, then fell away in a clean, uninterrupted sweep. That's when I saw what the overlay was really doing. It wasn't protecting a buffer. It was clearing a sightline. I searched the county's planning portal and found it, a proposed development packet filed under a name I didn't recognize at first, Creekside View. The documents were glossy, optimistic, and filled with phrases like elevated living and panoramic canyon experience. One rendering stopped me cold. A clubhouse perched on a ridge, glass railing, infinity edge deck, morning light spilling across the canyon like it had been staged for a brochure. The vantage point was unmistakable. My ridge. My house wasn't shown. It had been airbrushed out, replaced with empty space and promise. A caption beneath the image read, "Unobstructed western views reserved for premium lots." I sat back and let it settle. They didn't want my house. They wanted what my house was standing on. The pink line wasn't a mistake. It was a wedge, a way to push just far enough to claim control without triggering alarms. If I folded, they'd call it voluntary integration. If I didn't, they'd call it enforcement. Either way, the outcome was the same. Clear the ridge. I printed everything. The original survey, photos of the iron pins, the GIS layers with mismatched tax data, the creekside view renderings with my ridge highlighted in all but name. When I lined it all up on the table, the story told itself. They needed my elevation, they needed my view, and they were willing to redraw reality to get it. That realization changed everything. Up until then, I'd treated this like a dispute, a misunderstanding that could be corrected if the right person looked closely enough. But misunderstandings don't come with glossy brochures and erased houses. This was intent, calculated, quiet, profitable. I thought back to Karen standing on my deck, not bothering to look at the beams I'd cut by hand, to Travis smiling while talking about cooperation, to the way the sheriff had paused when the coordinates didn't add up. They were all pieces of the same machine. And now, I finally understood the blueprint. I packed the documents into a folder, thick enough to bend at the corners, and set it by the door. I didn't feel angry, I felt focused. Because once you see the lie clearly, you stop arguing with it. You start dismantling it. And the first thing that lie couldn't survive was daylight. The pressure didn't ease after I found the lie. It sharpened. Paper stopped being patient and started getting close. Deadlines tightened. The language shifted from may to will, from suggestions to instructions, from letters to visits. The sheriff came back 3 days later. Same truck, same steady posture, different energy. He parked farther up the drive this time, closer than before, like the space itself was under negotiation. Karen arrived right behind him in her SUV, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses already on. I met them at the deck. The sheriff spoke first. "Mr. Calloway, we need to clarify an occupancy issue." Karen stepped in without waiting. "There have been complaints," she said. "Multiple safety concerns, unapproved habitation inside HOA territory." I held up my hand, not to stop her, just to slow the pace. "This house isn't occupied," I said. "It's under construction, and it's not in your HOA." She slid a page forward, already prepared. "According to the updated overlay, that overlay doesn't change tax jurisdiction," I said evenly, "and it doesn't move iron pins." The sheriff glanced down at the map. Then he did something small but telling. He took off his sunglasses. He studied the page again, longer this time, tracing the coordinates with his finger. Karen continued talking, faster now, stacking phrases like sandbags. "Fire mitigation standards require." "Where did these coordinates come from?" the sheriff asked. Karen didn't answer immediately. She smiled, adjusted the clipboard, shifted her weight. "They're county approved," she said. "Compiled during the wildfire buffer update." The sheriff nodded once, but he didn't put the glasses back on. He clicked his radio off. The sudden quiet felt deliberate. "Approved by which office?" he asked. Karen's smile thinned. "The planning committee. It's all documented." "Then it'll be easy to verify," he said. She pivoted, switching tactics. "Sheriff, with respect, we're not here to debate mapping theory. We're here to prevent a liability issue. This structure has a clean title," I said, "and a survey older than your HOA." I handed him the folder. He didn't rush it. He opened it, flipped pages, paused at the photos of the iron pins, the deed, the tax layer printout with the unchanged district code. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in concentration. Karen noticed. She stepped closer to him, lowered her voice. "This doesn't need to escalate." That was the moment the squeeze turned into an attack. 2 days later, the notices doubled. An anonymous complaint hit the county building department. Unlicensed structural development, fire code violations, environmental disturbance. A preliminary fine estimate arrived by email. $125,000. Then came the drone footage. Photos of my house from above. Angles I hadn't flown. Shots framed to exaggerate slope and proximity. Stripped of context and labeled hazardous encroachment. The sheriff returned again, this time with a deputy. No lights, no sirens, just procedure. "We're issuing a notice of voluntary vacation," he said, voice flat. 72 hours. Karen stood behind him, satisfied. "It's temporary," she said, "until compliance is resolved." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at the sheriff. He hesitated, just a beat too long. His eyes flicked to the coordinates again, then to the ridge beyond the deck, where the canyon dropped away in clean, uninterrupted view. I could see the question forming. That night, the emails multiplied. Environmental review, wildlife disruption, water flow interference. Each complaint came from a different address, a different letterhead, different masks, same hand. I forwarded everything to one person and one person only. A land use attorney who understood that when pressure arrives from every direction at once, it's not enforcement, it's choreography. I didn't feel trapped, I felt measured, because pressure only works if you don't know where it's coming from. And now I did. There's a moment in every fight when panic burns off. What replaces it isn't courage, it's calculation. That moment came for me sometime after midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with the house quiet and the ridge outside invisible in the dark. I laid everything out. Letters, screenshots, maps, photos of iron pins gleaming through scraped dirt. I stopped reacting. I started engineering. I built a timeline first. Not emotional, not narrative, just facts, dates, filings, edit windows, who touched what and when. I flagged the inconsistencies that kept repeating, language that sounded official but never named an office, deadlines that carried no statutory reference, threats that leaned on authority without ever quite proving it. Then I went back to the maps. I overlaid the HOA's buffer on the county parcel layer. I overlaid that on the assessor's tax layer. I highlighted the missing step, the one no one talks about because it's boring and absolute. Revenue. Jurisdiction without taxation is theater. Authority without assessment is pretend. If they wanted governance, they had to accept obligation. And they hadn't. I drafted a clean summary, 3 pages, no adjectives. I attached exhibits, photos of iron pins set deep into bedrock, deed references, assessor codes that never changed, screenshots of the GIS edit history showing a single update window, no public hearing ID, no assessor sign-off. Then I called Mabel Lewis. Mabel doesn't waste time. She answers questions the way some people throw knives, clean and accurate. "Email me everything," she said, "and don't say another word to them." I sent the file. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. There was a pause on the line. Not silence, processing. "I usually charge $400 an hour to find mistakes like this," she said. "You just handed me the smoking gun for free." I exhaled for the first time in days. She walked through it with me, methodically, not to take control, just to confirm what I already knew. "They extended an overlay," she said, "without registering it as a taxable jurisdiction. That means no enforcement authority, no fines, no governance. At best, they're posturing. At worst, they're trespassing on paper." She didn't sound excited. She sounded impressed. "Most people never look past the pretty map," she added. "You went straight to the bones." We moved fast after that. Mabel drafted a cease and desist, not emotional, not threatening, surgical. It cited the failure to register the expanded zone with the state assessor, the absence of revenue filings, and the improper use of enforcement notices beyond recognized jurisdiction. At the same time, she filed a request with the Department of Revenue for an audit of Highland Peak's boundary expansion. That wasn't a lawsuit. It was a mirror. If the HOA wanted to keep pushing, they'd have to answer questions they'd been avoiding for years: back taxes, disclosure failures, and why a fire buffer looked suspiciously like a development footprint. I sent one final email to Karen. No accusations, no demands. Just a notice that all future communication would go through counsel. The response was immediate and telling. She didn't argue the facts. She accused me of being uncooperative. 2 days later, the Department of Revenue acknowledged receipt of the audit request. Formal language, neutral tone, the kind that lands like a weight because it doesn't care who you are. Translation: Someone official is now looking. That's when the noise changed. Emails stopped escalating and started hedging. Phrases like pending review and temporary pause appeared where deadlines used to be. The sheriff didn't come back, but I heard from someone who knew him that questions were being asked downtown. Quiet ones. Meanwhile, the story found legs. A Channel 6 producer reached out after seeing the documents I'd linked publicly. He asked one question that mattered. Who benefits if your house goes away? I told him to look at the ridge. The segment aired 3 days later, 10 minutes, no music, just documents, maps, and a drone shot that made the geometry undeniable. The headline read, "Who owns the ridge?" Emails flooded the county, retired attorneys, surveyors, former HOA members who'd never seen the full plans. One wrote simply, "I thought the buffer was about fire safety. No one told us about the clubhouse." That night, Mabel called again. "They flinched," she said. "That's not victory, but it's the first honest reaction you've seen." I stood on the deck and looked out over the canyon, stars punching through the dark like they always had. For the first time since the sheriff read me that notice, I felt steady. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally moved onto ground I understood. I didn't build this house by rushing. I didn't defend it by shouting. I engineered the truth until it couldn't be ignored. And somewhere in an office downtown, a file with Karen Larson's name on it was no longer just paperwork. It was a problem. The morning they came for Karen, the mountain was calm. No wind, no drama, just that steady quiet you get when the day hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. I was pressure washing the lower deck, watching 6 years of dust and pollen peel away in clean lines. I heard engines, more than before. Black sedans this time, unmarked. One county cruiser tucked in behind them. No vests, no clipboards, just business. They stopped at the HOA office down the road. The converted farmhouse with leased art and quartz countertops meant to look rustic without ever being used. Karen stepped out smiling, already rehearsing the charm. That smile lasted exactly as long as it took for the lead detective to introduce himself. She started talking before he finished. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "If this is about Mr. Calloway, I can explain." He raised a hand. "Ms. Larson, you're under arrest." The words didn't land at first. She laughed once, sharp and incredulous. "Do you know who represents this HOA?" she snapped. "I will have your badge." The sheriff stepped forward. Same man, same steady posture, different authority. He took off his sunglasses. "Turn around, Karen." She froze, looked at him like she was seeing a stranger. "This is outrageous," she said, voice climbing. That ridge was earmarked for development. The board approved. "For a clubhouse view," the sheriff said evenly. "Premium lots, unobstructed western exposure." Her mouth opened, closed. The detective read the charges out loud, one by one. Fraudulent misrepresentation, falsification of public records, attempted unlawful property seizure, tax evasion, conspiracy. Each word stripped something away. Karen tried one last time. "You can't do this. This HOA—" The sheriff interrupted, calm as a metronome. "You have the right to remain silent." He read the Miranda rights cleanly, professionally, like he'd done it 1,000 times before, and like he meant every word this time. When he cuffed her, she jerked once, more insulted than afraid. As they walked her to the car, she twisted back toward me across the distance, eyes hard. "You think you've won?" she said. "That house was an obstacle, nothing more." Obstacle. The word hung there, thin and ugly. The sheriff waited until the doors closed. Then he walked over to where I stood, water still dripping from the deck boards. "I owe you an apology," he said. I didn't rush to answer. "I should have pressed harder the first time," he went on. "The coordinates didn't sit right. The tax layer didn't match. I let procedure slow me down." He looked past me, out toward the ridge, toward the view that had started all of this. "They needed that sightline," he said, "and they thought paper would move stone." I nodded. "Paper only works when no one checks the pins." A corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, recognition. "Your title stands," he said, "clean, unbroken. All enforcement tied to that overlay is frozen." Later that afternoon, the news broke it wide open. Board members resigned. One admitted they'd never seen the Creekside view renderings. Another said she thought the buffer was about fire mitigation. Doug Penner, the GIS consultant, turned state's witness within 48 hours. He handed over emails, draft maps, and a voice memo where Karen described my house as temporary interference in the development timeline. The court moved faster than anyone expected. An injunction dissolved the HOA outright. All actions tied to the expansion overlay were voided. The judge didn't raise his voice when he spoke. He didn't need to. This case demonstrates an egregious abuse of private governance structures, he said. The defendant sought to appropriate value through deception. Compensation followed, not symbolic, substantial. Enough to cover delays, legal costs, and the damage you can't itemize on a receipt. I didn't celebrate. I went back to the ridge. The house stood the same way it always had, scarred, solid, and honest. I walked through each room slowly, touching the rail we forged by hand, the beam we reset 3 times to get right. Outside, the canyon caught the last light of day. For the first time in months, the quiet felt earned again. The house is quiet now. Not the uneasy quiet that follows a fight, but the settled kind. The kind that comes when something has finally found its place and decided to stay. I finished the last details slowly. No rush, no deadlines breathing down my neck. I installed the final fixtures, added a second solar array, and set up a small weather station on the roofline. The mountain doesn't care about numbers, but I do. I like knowing what it's doing when I'm not looking. Above the bluff, I built one more thing. Not a statement, not a monument, an observation tower. Simple, wood and steel. Just high enough to see the canyon open up the way it always had, helping me understand why someone thought it was worth stealing. From up there, the view stretches wide and honest. No glass railings, no infinity edge, just air, distance, and perspective. Irony, done properly, doesn't need an explanation. A few months later, I held a small open house, not a party, more like a reckoning. Friends came, a few reporters, even some former HOA members who looked relieved to finally see the ridge without brochures lying to them. I pinned Karen's old overlay map to a board in the corner and titled it, How to Lose Everything. Beneath it, I mounted my original deed, steel frame, wire mesh, no glass. Paper doesn't need protection when the truth is sturdy. On the gate, I hung a new sign, hand-painted, simple. This is private land. This house was built by hand. Trespassers will be educated. Freedom lives here. People laughed, took pictures. One older man stood there longer than most, then nodded once and said, "This gives me hope." That surprised me more than anything else. I didn't set out to become a symbol. I just refused to disappear quietly. In the months that followed, the calls kept coming. Stories from Washington, Oregon, California. Same tactics, different names, quiet overlays, soft deadlines, pressure dressed up as procedure. So I helped where I could. We started small. Forums, Zoom calls, a simple site where people could upload maps and documents. Patterns emerged fast once people knew where to look. I testified later that year in front of the state Senate, not as an activist, just as a homeowner with receipts. One lawmaker quoted a line from my video back to me. "I built a house, not a battlefield." The bill passed by a landslide. Unauthorized HOA boundary expansion became a felony. Full public notice and opt-in signatures became mandatory. Quiet lines on maps lost their power. Back on the ridge, life settled into something like peace. My kids call the house the fortress. My wife still calls it madness made out of wood. But every night when we light the fireplace, I catch her smiling at the beams, at the walls, at the proof that effort matters. Last week I watched the sunrise from the tower with a cup of coffee and no agenda. The canyon looked the same as it did 8 years ago, untouched by glass decks or developer fantasies. The mountain didn't change. The lines didn't move. I didn't just win a legal fight, I kept a promise. And this time, I don't plan on giving up a single inch.